In Matthew 5:14, Jesus told the disciples, "You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid." Jesus told his disciples they were the light of the world. But many scriptures in the Old Testament and the New Testament say that Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus himself said he's the light of the world in John 8:12. There can be no doubt who the true light of the world is. It's Jesus Christ. But why did Jesus use that symbolism to describe himself in John 8:12? And what were the circumstances when he made that statement? I'm going to look for answers for those questions beginning in John 7. I'll trace the account of Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles in those chapters. So let's turn to John 7. Beginning in verse 1, it tells us that Jesus was in Galilee. And then verse 2 says, the Feast of Tabernacles was about to begin soon. Comparing the period of time, it would be equivalent to maybe Friday or Saturday previous, a couple of days ago. Beginning in verse 3, the scripture tells us that his brothers tried to convince him to go to Jerusalem for the feast. Verse 8 says that he declined, but he sent them on ahead. Then verse 10 says he later went to Jerusalem by himself, and it does say secretly. John 14, he's reached Jerusalem, and he begins teaching in the temple. He goes right to the center of activities in Jerusalem. And now it's about the middle of the feast. He began giving the people clues to reveal his identity. He wasn't telling them outright, but he was giving some pretty strong, definite clues. Verses 15 to 36 describes controversial questioning and arguing that began almost immediately as he began to speak. Some believed what Jesus said, and some didn't, especially the religious authorities. In verse 28 of chapter 7, John 7, notice that Jesus was still teaching in the temple. And the controversies continued down to verse 37. So I'm going to give a little background now leading up to that point. There were two traditions that were observed by the Jews during the Feast of Tabernacles. These traditions began at least 100 years earlier when the feast was being kept in Jerusalem at the temple. The two ceremonies were the water ceremony and the illumination or the light ceremony. The water ceremony was observed every morning during the feast. The high priest would lead a procession of people from the temple to the pool of Siloam. There he filled a pitcher with water. Then he led the procession back to the temple, and there was much ritual along the way. Ritual including rejoicing. The people, this was a happy time of the year for the people. And so the people at the feast would have been very familiar with this ceremony. And then in verse 37, Jesus gave a revealing phrase describing himself. He said, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me." And then in verse 38, "Out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." So these are references to that water ceremony. The crowd remained divided over who Jesus was. Some scriptures in this chapter tell us some believed what he said and some didn't. And the Pharisees knew that he was equating himself with God by what he said. They continued arguing with Jesus, including doubting that, and they argued with themselves, including doubting that the Messiah could come from Galilee. So we get to the end of chapter 7, and down to verse 53. It says, "The day ended and everyone went home." chapter 7, I believe it's in fact, it is verse 37. It says this was the last day of the feast. The most prevalent belief is this would have been the seventh day. So now we get to chapter 8, verse 1. It says Jesus spent the night on the Mount of Olives. Didn't have a hotel or a motel room to go to. Verse 8, he was in the temple again teaching. And this was likely on the 8th day then, what we call the last great day. Then there's an inset account in verses 3 through 11. This is an account of Jesus making a judgment about an accused woman. So it doesn't pertain to the other aspects of the chapter. So we'll continue on beginning in verse 12, 8:12. And this is when he told the people, I am the light of the world. So in verse 12, chapter 8, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now he was probably referring to the other ceremony that was commonly and regularly practiced at the feast, the illumination of the light ceremony. It began the second evening of the feast, and it continued every night after that. It was a celebration or an observance that was done at night because it involved lights. And in this ceremony, the priests would lead a procession of Levites and musicians through the temple until they arrived at the treasury. This was a certain portion of the temple. This part of the temple was also called the Court of the Women. It was a wide open space, open to the outdoors. And it had 4 large lampposts. Each one was 75 feet tall. Each lamppost was in a corner of this square. So this court or open area was capable of holding a large group of people. And Jesus was probably addressing a large group of people there. So there was much rejoicing that accompanied the ceremony, including singing psalms and dancing. Sometimes the celebration would go far into the night, maybe all night through, with singing, dancing, and just joyful rejoicing. At the beginning of the ceremony in the evening, young priests would climb ladders and light oil-soaked wicks at the top of the poles. The wicks, I believe, were actually old garments. So these were 75 feet tall, and I don't know exactly the dimensions of the bowls at the top, but they probably were large enough to hold robes and garments, probably, that were being discarded, but they found a good use for them. So, and they didn't have modern lift equipment. They were just ladders. I find it daunting and dangerous enough for myself to climb a 16-foot ladder to the second floor of my house. So they were climbing 75 feet. And of course the poles were narrow, so how they balanced the whole thing, I don't know. But probably that's why the account says young people went up those poles. As I just often say, it's great to be young as I look back on my youth. There was much rejoicing that accompanied the ceremony. Jewish history says that these were big fires at the top of the poles, 4 of them. And the saying goes that there was no courtyard in Jerusalem that was not illuminated from the light of the giant lamps. So you could see these lamps from around the town, not just in the temple. The illumination ceremony reminded the people of God's presence in the wilderness when he was his presence was in the pillar of fire that accompanied them, and it also reminded them of God's presence that filled Solomon's temple at his dedication. So in verse 20 of chapter 8, Jesus stood in the treasury during his exchange with the people, and it was probably early morning on that 8th day, and he was standing in the shadow of these giant lampposts. It seems pretty obvious that he used the familiarity of the illumination ceremony to reinforce the point that he is the light of the world. After he told the people this, the rest of chapter 8 tells us how the Pharisees continued arguing and doubting him. But verse 30 says that many people came to believe what he said. Jesus was giving clue after clue about his identity. And the people that were familiar with the scriptures would have equated God and the Messiah with light, and equated the fact that Jesus was making the claim that he was that personage. Isaiah 9 especially connects the Messiah to Galilee. Let's turn to Isaiah 9. Not only does it connect the Messiah to Galilee, but to light. So, Isaiah 9 verses 1 and 2. Verse 1, "But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations." Zebulun and Naphtali were adjacent to the Sea of Galilee in the north. Then in verse 2 it says, "The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light will shine." And so those that knew that scripture, and I'm sure the Pharisees were familiar with it, they would have been aware that when Jesus said he was the light of the world, and that people knew that he came from Galilee, they could make that connection. But the hostility of the Pharisees prevented them from believing it. Matthew acknowledged that Isaiah 9 verses 1 and 2 referred to Jesus the Messiah. He quoted those verses in Matthew 4 verses 15 and 16. There's other references to the Messiah and light also in Isaiah 49 verse 6. If you want to turn there, you may. I'll just read that for you. Isaiah 49:6. "I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth." Pretty clearly talking about the Messiah. And Isaiah 60 verses 1 through 3. 60 verse 1. "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and deep darkness the people. But the Lord will arise over you, and his glory will be seen upon you." Then verse 3, "The Gentiles shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." And so Jesus was amplifying these scriptures, talking about himself, and this, along with the other clues and statements he was making at this feast, he was telling people that he was the Messiah. He earlier had told the people that he was the source of rivers of living water. Now he told them that he was the light of the world. He left no doubt at the end of the feast when he spoke to the Pharisees in John 8:58, going back to John 8. The very end of the chapter, Jesus said to them in verse 58, "Very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am." The Pharisees clearly understood this. They understood well enough to pick stones up and throw at him. So Jesus used symbols to identify himself at this time. These symbols identified God and the Messiah in the Old Testament scriptures with light and water. He used very vivid circumstances to enhance his teaching about his identity. referring to those ceremonies that had been conducted. And there is historical documentation that going back at least 100 years, 100 BC roughly, that they were conducting these ceremonies. Teachers use a technique called making connections. This allows students to use previous experience or knowledge to enhance learning. And Jesus, being a master teacher, was using these techniques, the familiarity of these ceremonies, to amplify his teaching. And again, some people believed what he said, but the Pharisees never did believe him. Jesus told the disciples, they are the light of the world, but even we as his disciples can only reflect his light. We don't shine our own light, we reflect his. He's the source, the true source of the light of the world, and we can only reflect his light if we remain in his light. We remain in his light only as we follow him and strive to do what he says. Only then can we be reflectors of his light to those around us.